Good morning, everyone. Got a special guest today. It's Seth Paridon. He's a historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. He's also the co-host of the popular Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast and YouTube channel. Um, Seth was fortunate to interview hundreds, or maybe probably thousands, of the World War II veterans. Oh, thousands. I figure that. I invited Seth today to share some of the stories, the Guadalcanal vets, because me and him got to talking, and he's a friend of mine, and he said he had some good stories on the Guadalcanal vets. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Seth to the channel, and hopefully we'll have a good chat today. And I'll bring in Seth now. And Seth, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing pretty good, man. Doing pretty good. It's early for you, but late for me here. It's 1400 my time.
Well, it's 5:12 a.m. my time, so that's why I look so bright and sprightly. What's the temp there?
Heat index is about 105
And on the other side of the world, on the bottom
Fahrenheit.
side, oh, wow, yeah, Celsius. So on my end, it's what feels like -6. So that's like, well, that's Celsius. So what, like 22 or 23 degrees. Nice
Dang.
and frosty this morning. So, yeah, too bad we can't
Yeah.
live in the medium, huh?
Yeah, really. Seriously. Yeah. It's either
Too
too hot or too
extreme.
damn cold.
Yeah. All right, buddy. I know time's a factor here. We're all busy men.
Oh, we're good.
Can you tell us a little about your background and how you came to interview these vets?
Yeah, sure. Once again, I'm a if those who watch my YouTube channel and or listen to the show that you know who I am, but for those who don't, I'm a professional historian. I went to school to be a historian, and I'm from the city of New Orleans. And National World War II Museum is in New Orleans. And in 2004, I was hired by the National World War II Museum. I was the first historian hired by the National World War II Museum. And my role initially when I was hired was to build the oral history archive for that museum and everything that we were collecting. And I later hired a team to work with me. I had other historians who worked. I was the chief historian, and they guys worked for me. Um, we started collecting oral histories that were going to be put in the permanent exhibitions within the museum and in the archives. And actually, that's where most of them reside, or in the archives. There's only a handful out on display. Anyway, regardless of this, um, I being the boss, I got to cherry pick who I wanted to go see and what I wanted to focus on. And my initial focus, no surprise here, is veterans of the Pacific War, and especially the early portion of the war, Battle of Midway, Battle of Coral Sea, and anything to do with Guadalcanal, sea, land, and air. And then obviously a lot of things after that. So I was fortunate enough prior to working for World War II Museum that I did some of the initial oral histories for the HBO miniseries The Pacific.
Mm.
And I came to know a lot of guys that served in K Company 3rd Battalion 5th and H Company 2nd Battalion 1st. Of course, that's would be Sledge's company K35 and was Lecky's company H21. So I got to know a lot of those guys. And then when I went to work for World War II Museum, or D-Day Museum at the time, one of my very first trips that I took was to an H21 reunion in Buffalo, New York. And I brought my camera and my sound equipment up there, and I sat there and interviewed as many of them as I could, um, which was all of them that were there at that reunion. I don't remember. It's like a dozen or more guys that were there
Wow.
at that time. And these are guys that served with Lucky, that were on the canal, that were at Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Ocala. So, I mean, they were, they ran the gamut of the war, literally the entire conflict.
Oh, wow. I mean, that would have been a great opportunity. And
It
you
was.
kind of look back now and say, geez, I wish those guys were around to, when I do my writings and researching all the time, I'd go, oh, I wish this guy was still around, or I wish this guy was still here. And um, yeah, so what a great opportunity. So how many, I guess, interviews you think you would actually done? I mean, you said you did thousands, but
Yeah, I mean, when I started there, we had a grand total of 24 oral histories in the collection. 24. And when I transferred to a different position within the museum in 2018, we had over 5,000. And there was
wow.
only and there were only a team of uh at any one time there were four historians, of which I was one. Sometimes there were five, it just depended. Some guys came and left. But and I mean we were stepping and fetching. We were going every other week, or sometimes 2 weeks in a row, whatever. We would try to be home every couple of weeks. And we were going all over the country, and in some instances all over the world. But
He was the road show.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
Going all over the place. But it was incredibly gratifying getting to know those guys. Because I mean, like I've said before, I met some people that I'd read about as a kid,
Yes.
and I mean, guys that one of the books that put the hook in my mouth was The Big E by Edwin Stafford, and there
Mm.
was a guy's name in
Enterprise.
there. Yeah, about the Enterprise. And there was a guy's name in there. It's hard to forget because it was weirdly spelled Veteza, Vejtasa, Swede, Stanley
Mm.
Swede Veteza.
Oh yeah.
And I just read about him in that book and I read about him afterwards and and saw him in documentaries. And this guy was just like a hero to me. And I came to know him and was like close personal friends with him for the last 5 years of his life. We'd
Wow.
corresponded, oh, sometimes not, I don't want to say daily, but at least 2 or 3 times a week, either phone call or email or whatever. And he was just one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of guys that were like that. But they were all incredibly cool people. And
Yeah, I
I
bet.
still remember a lot of them.
Um, okay, Seth, I think with is any, I guess you've got so many and we've got limited time, I understand, but we could probably talk all day for over how many Guadalcanal guys you think you interviewed? It's probably hard to tell, huh?
I couldn't give you an accurate answer on that. I mean, when I first started interviewing the Guadalcanal guys, I focused on the land campaign. Um,
Which is not bad
Yeah,
for me.
exactly. I know that's it right up your alley. And then
Yeah,
later I started branching out into the naval campaign, which is good for me, and,
yeah,
and for multiple reasons. And
yeah.
it was, I mean, I couldn't tell you. I honestly have no idea. But there are several that stick out in my mind for multiple reasons, not the least of which is they were either really cool, they were really good, or they were really cool and really good, or they were like well-known dudes.
Well known, yeah,
Yeah, and well known from the campaign. And
yeah.
and one of those guys was Sweeney, was John B. Sweeney, who
Okay, John Sweeney. Can you tell me about John? I'll see if I can get his picture up real quick where you talk about John. I've got a
yeah,
few bits and pieces I could add in too, but um, I've got a couple of pictures of John.
yeah. Sweeney
Um,
Sweeney, of course, he was a captain during the time of Guadalcanal. He was captain, company commander, B Company, First Raider Battalion, Edson Traders. And he later retired as a colonel, if I remember correctly, from the Corps. I mean, he saw all kinds of action. It wasn't just Guadalcanal. He saw the action like later on in his life and his military campaign, or his military career, rather, I should say. And he was just this hardcore, hard charging dude. He was a very matter of fact speaker. Like he was very, this is what this is. This is what we did. This is what I saw. And in some instances, when you're doing oral histories and guys tell you that it's boring, he wasn't boring because he would get into, he would say, this is what we did, but this is what this guy next to me did, and I remember what this dude did, and I was saying this and I was saying that, and he, listening to him talk was like listening to the script of a movie. And
wow. Yeah.
he remembered most everything, guys' individual names and what they did and individual actions and things like that. So he had a memory like a steel trap. I admittedly didn't know Sweeney exceedingly well. I only met him twice, interviewed
Mm,
him once and met him twice, but he was one of those ones that stuck in my head because of the role that he played on Guadalcanal. And, of
yeah.
course, the first big thing he does on the canal is one of the first big things the first big thing that the Raiders do on the canal is the Tassamboco raid. And that's where, he really cuts his chops right at the Tassamboco raid. And of course, he's on Edson's Ridge later. But Dave, the Tassamboco raid was huge operation for the Raiders leading up to Edson's Ridge. So,
Well, Sweeney here, you got the photo of he's actually on the canal, and you can see he's a very serious looking fella. And he's got his rising gun there. That's the young Sweeney. So he was an officer in the First Raider Battalion. I'll show you. He replicated, I think, 50 years later. And let's see if I can get the other photo up of the older Sweeney. All right, now here's a photo of the, I call it old Sweeney. And you can just see um, he still looks like a serious guy. So he's replicating the pose from Guadalcanal. So I don't know. It's hard to tell. I got this from the Raiders patch, which is the Raiders newsletter. I don't know if that's a
yeah,
rising gun or not, but
can't
kind of
tell.
looks like one. But
Looks like
anyway,
it could be. Yeah.
yeah. So is that the way he looked when you interviewed him?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
He
Yeah.
still had a gun.
He was a he may have in the house, I don't know, but he
I
didn't have it
guarantee
on
he
him when
probably
I
had
talked to
one.
him.
He had one close. I guarantee it. He looked like a
Prob
serious character. And
he was a serious dude, yeah.
in reading the reports that he's written, now you've got to interview him, which is was great. Personally, I've read some of his memoirs and accounts and things. In fact, I used to go to the Middle Spur in Edson's Ridge, and he was in at that stage in Edson's Ridge. He was the B Company commander, and he was appointed B Company. I think he was still first lieutenant. He might have just made captain, but he was a B Company commander, and he describes his command post where it was, and right beside the road on the reverse slope of the Middle Ridge, because as you know, you got Hill 1, Middle Ridge, and Hill 2 where Edson was. So on the second night, he's in this foxhole and he's with his first sergeant, and I remember finding that hole. That hole is still there on the reverse slope. I used to sit in it and I'd read his accounts,
Oh man.
and it was so good. It just really brought it to life. And when he starts describing stuff, you looked around, you got, well, there it is. But yeah, he's like you said, Tazamboko, right? He did quite well, but he was a real kick ass guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
real good
Yeah.
commander. They all loved him.
Yeah. He was a fire, I knew a guy who was a naval aviator named James D. Ramage, Jig Dog Ramage. And Jig used to refer to guys like Sweeney, used to refer to them as fire eaters.
Oh
and
yeah,
and he was a fire eater. Sweeney was a fire eater, but when I knew him, he was a little more subdued. You know,
yeah.
he,
That old photo, he didn't look too subdued there.
he was
He
yeah. I
still
mean, he
put
was
the
still a
fire in you.
serious dude, but yeah, no, I wouldn't want to cross him. But
No, no,
he was a little more subdued. He was a super nice guy,
I
and
bet.
he, like I said, he remembered I mean, everything. It was literally, some guys, remember dribs and drabs, and some guys, for whatever reason, we all know why, they blocked things out, but
Yeah,
he did not. I mean, that dude remembered everything. He had like not a photographic memory, but pretty dang close to it. He could remember names and places and exactly what happened. Like, and I remember the Tassimboca raid, and I started bringing it up more than anything is that, because, as you know, Edson's Ridge was so friggin' chaotic, at night and everything else is going on. But Tassimboca, he was right up there. I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know, 20 feet from the Japanese, and screaming at him and hollering at him and, trying to confuse him. I think he was yelling something like Baka or something like that, if I remember
yeah.
correctly, trying to basically make them look up to see what
Pissed
the
him
heck
off.
that's, yeah, yeah, yeah. And they were having a war of words, Maline, you die, and all this other jazz
They
back and
fired a
forth.
75, I think, or 70 millimeter. I think it's 75. They fired it at him, at them.
Yeah, it was like one of those three-man artillery. We actually have one here in our museum.
Yeah,
Little small, little teeny tiny artillery piece.
yeah, probably
But
70.
yeah, he remembered everything about that event. He remembered sending. I can't remember
It's pretty
the
traumatic, also. You remember that?
yeah, but he remembered the guy, the patrol that he sent around to the flank that took out. There was a Japanese. There was a 90, either a 96 or a 97 Nambu light machine gun that was laying fire
Yeah,
down on his squad or his platoon. And he was talking about that, and he sent, and I cannot remember the gentleman's name. It was a BAR gunner, and he took two riflemen
yeah,
with him. They went around the side and flanked and shot all these guys. And he watched all this stuff go down because he couldn't get a shot at the Japanese from where he was
yeah,
without getting himself shot. And
yeah,
he watched his Marines walk around the side and take these Japanese out because they were, like I told you, they were from, I don't know, 50, 60 yards away. He could see them clearly with his naked eye, but he couldn't get a shot at them. But he remembered everything. He was super, super, super intelligent guy.
So remember the part on the ridge, if you remember. Um, so he's there on the second night. He's got C Company of the first parachute battalion to his left,
Right.
and for whatever reason they've withdrawn back, and he's left his left flank exposed. And that's how he said, we got to get out of here. But he didn't want to, I guess, leave his position. So that's when the Raiders, when they communicated by using nicknames. Edson was Red Mike.
Right.
I forgot what. I have to read it, but Sweeney had a certain name. So Barak was Edson's runner, and the Japanese had infiltrated the field phone lines. And I think at the time they yelled out from Hill 2 to the Spur to whatever Sweeney's nickname was. He goes, say,
I
Big
don't
John or
remember.
whatever.
Right.
Said Red Mike. Burak yells it out. Said Big John, Red Mike said it's okay to come back. So that was the code word to move back. So he knew it was actually Edson giving that order,
Right.
not an infiltrated line. So yeah, they pulled back from that. Um, so who's another one that really stands out?
Uh, there were a bunch. There was one
I bet.
guy that I came to know quite well, but it wasn't through Guadalcanal, although he was there. He wasn't there very long. His name was James Goodrich, Jim Goodrich. Jimmy Goodrich was, at the time when he landed on Guadalcanal, he was with the Second Marine Division. I think he was L36, if I remember correctly. And he didn't get there till like January of 43. And I want to pause there for a minute because I know you always talk about this, and this is super important, is that, everybody thinks First Marine Division on Guadalcanal, and they obviously were there, but so was the Second Marine Division. Now, granted, Jimmy Goodrich didn't get there until January because Sixth Marines didn't get there till, was it sixth? Yeah, I think he was sixth.
Six. Yeah, he was. You said it. You was right.
Yeah, they don't get there till later, but there's other regiments of the Second Marine Division that's on Guadalcanal from the friggin' beginning, right?
Yes, it was Second Marines. It was Second Marines, and for some of the viewers might get confused when we say Second Marines. The Marines refer to that as a regiment, not Second Marine Division. Marines
Right.
refer to a division as a division. So the Second Marines was part of the First Marine Division on loan because the Seventh Marine Regiment was still in Samoa at the time, so they needed a third rifle regiment. So the Second Marines became part of the First Marine Division. They're on loan. So what happened was, in fact, the Second Marines were the first unit to land during the whole Guadalcanal campaign. Havelock Bay, they landed at 7:40 in the morning, which is in Florida Islands, right next to Tulagi. And they landed there to take out a village to screen the arrival of the raiders at Blue Beach. So, in fact, the Second Marine Regiment was the first unit to be involved in a campaign. And what's so ironic, when the First Marine Division, the last of it left at the end of December 42, the Second Marines was still on the island fighting away. And in fact, they kicked off the January 13th offensive, the last offensive by General Patch. The Second Marines kicked it off with the 8th Marines right beside them because on the 4th of January, that's when 43, that's when the Second Marine Division with the headquarters and their final regiment, which is the 6th Marines, arrived. And then the division formed. And the poor Second Marines, and they finally left after day one of the offensive. They went and took their objective, and then the 6th Marines relieved them, and the Second Marines went back to the perimeter, and they left a couple of weeks later. But those poor guys, they were, you could talk about disgruntled and very agitated. Yeah. So they go, we're the first ones to land and watch the whole division leave, and we're still here fighting away. So yeah. The 6th Marines landed on the 4th of January 43. So, but they were engaged in the later fighting, especially around the Point Cruz area, and then the push down the coast. You notice I didn't say mop up because that's another, as you know, one of my pet peeves, mopping up. Yeah.
Right.
So I'll share a photo of Goodrich and you talk about him.
Yeah, sure.
He's 16 years old. He lied about his age.
Yep. He was from a little, if I remember correctly, he enlisted in a place called Pampa, Texas. And
Yep.
I couldn't tell you where the hell Pampa, Texas is. When I knew him, he lived in Enid, Oklahoma. And when I met him with his grandson, Kevin Selden, who's a mutual friend of ours. I met Goodrich on Guam, and I followed him to Iwo Jima because after Guadalcanal, of course, he stayed in Second Marine Division, and he lands at a little place called Baishio and Tarawa and sees the action there. And then he goes home and he thinks that his tour is done because he's done his 2 campaigns, which was kind of the limit then. And then he gets stuck in the 5th Marine Division as cadre and he lands on Iwo Jima. So
Talking about
yeah.
But he's got luck. He's unlucky and lucky. He's unlucky.
I mean, he gets hit. He gets hit on Iwo and he gets evacuated, but he obviously lives. But on Guadalcanal, like you said, he's 16. I mean, look at that picture. I mean, he's a boy. He's a baby.
He's 17 on Guadalcanal, I think.
Okay,
his
17.
Grandson told me, but he's 16 in his photo here. He's a kid.
Just a kid. And he gets on the canal. He's a BAR gunner. And he remembered his first kill, as it were.
Yeah.
They were going out on a patrol, like, and that's all it was a patrol. And he said that he was with a gentleman, I can't remember his name, that was carrying a shotgun. And the man with the shotgun was in front of him, and he had a BAR. And as they're walking down this trail, they'd come under fire just recently before, like just a few minutes before, they'd taken some mortar fire or something. And they get up and they're moving out and they're going to try and seek out where the fire came from, and eliminate the threat. And a Japanese officer just like literally just pops out on the middle of a trail and jumps right in front of Goodrich. And he said, I remember him saying this. He says, I was so startled by what happened. Despite my training, I didn't know what to do. Like I just stood
Yeah.
there, frozen in time because this guy just appeared in front of him. And the
Yeah.
gentleman that was with him that carried the shotgun, as the trench guns are loaded with double-aught buck. And he says, the guy just instantly reacted, boom, and gave him, uh,
Yeah.
a shot with the 12 gauge, and then that snapped Goodrich into reality. And he says he just stitched him up and down with the BAR. And he said that was his first kill. He said, but I remember him telling me, he says, I was 16 years old. He said, I'd never killed anybody before. And just the
Yeah, of
thought of
course.
doing that was so foreign to me. And he says, even though we'd been trained and all this other stuff, he says, until you do it,
Yeah.
it's a different, I don't care how long you've been trained, until you actually are faced with that situation, it's a different world. And he
Yeah.
said
It's
after
a
that, it was no
first
problem.
off
He
the
says, but
combat. Yeah.
until that time, it was a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a typical reaction, the first shock of a combat or up close personal contact. That's the kind of your body reaction sometimes.
Yeah. He talked about too. He talked a lot about different things on Guadalcanal. And he talked about the same things that everybody did, which was the weather. It was sucked. It was terrible. It rained. It was hotter than fire.
Hot.
And malaria. He got malaria. And it's like a badge of honor for going to Guadalcanal. You get malaria, and, and if you don't, then you're an oddity. I remember Dr.
Yeah.
Sid Phillips. He did not get malaria, and he was like, I never
Yeah.
got
That
it.
is oddity.
Yeah.
Yeah. First.
He's like,
Yeah.
I never got malaria. But
Only 9,000 other guys got it, but yeah, in the division.
right. And he had it. I
Mm.
remember him telling me, Goodrich telling me that he had an attack of malaria no less than 16 times.
In
And
his
no,
life.
now whether or not that was through the war or after the war, I frankly don't remember. If Kevin's watching
Probably
this,
after the war too,
no,
because it
sticks
continues.
with you. Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
But he was just an incredible guy. He talked to one of the things he talked about, I remember asking him because I'd met him on on Guam, and
Yeah.
then I went to Ewo with him, and then I went to his house in Enid and did like a formal like sit down, let's talk. And his wife cooked this magnificent lunch for us. I remember that quite well, and homemade apple pie. I remember that
Oh
too.
wow.
Yeah, it was good. And anyway, like back on the topic, he was telling me, he said, because I always ask those guys, especially the Marines and the soldiers that were on the front lines in the Pacific, what'd you think of the Japanese? Because it's a different war. I don't care what anybody says. It was a different war in the Pacific than it was in Europe. It was. And there were definite racial undertones to the war in the Pacific,
Mm.
and that is undeniable. And he said, they were taught to hate the Japanese. And of course, as we both know, you have to dehumanize the enemy to try and get a young man to try and kill someone most of the time. And he said, but all that training and all that dehumanizing really went into effect when they got to the island and they saw what the Japanese had done to some of their comrades, some of their Marines, whether they were in, you know, 3-6 or not. He remarked about one time they'd gone on a patrol and they found one of his, I think it was a sergeant or a sergeant that was in his platoon that had been captured by the Japanese, tied up to a tree and used as bayonet practice.
Mm.
And, they disemboweled the man, quite obviously while he was still alive, and, just tortured him until he died. And he said after that, he said, we had no problems.
Oh yeah.
Any question about killing before ended right then and there. He says, when we saw that, it's like that was it. It was over with. And this was one of the sweetest men you'd ever want to know in your life. Like he was just this soft-spoken, gentle, just good-natured human being. And when you hear somebody talk about things like that, when you're sitting face to face, and I'd came to know him pretty well, it makes an effect on you.
Mm.
Hearing somebody who's that calm, cool, and collected talking about killing with no remorse. It kind of puts a light bulb in the back of your head.
especially at that age too. I mean, it's when I was 18 years old, that's why they get 18 to 19 to 20-year olds. It's easier to switch your brain into that mode to do stuff like that. So you don't have a chance to think about it.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about, Mr. Goodrich?
Bob Goodrich, no, I mean, I could talk about Jim Goodrich for days. He was an incredible guy. Like I said, I met him on Iwo. I went to his house in Enid. I brought him to New Orleans we did something at the World War II Museum for, I don't remember what anniversary of Iwo it was. It doesn't matter anymore, but we brought him down and another friend of mine, Iron Mike Mervosh. And so we had 4th Marine Division, 5th Marine Division on stage, and they were talking about their experience. I interviewed them while they were on stage, talking to a crowd, and they were talking about, Iwo, and he would say that Iwo was the worst of them all.
That's going to be the next question of Tarawa and Iwo or
Yeah,
Basho.
he'd tell you
Basho was
straight
over
up that,
quick, but yeah.
yeah, he'd tell you straight up that they were both, equally terrible, but Iwo was the worst of them all. I forget how long he was on Iwo for. He
I was
was on
going to
there a long
say,
time.
yeah, that would be. Oh, I just
Yeah. And he was on Tarawa for the whole 76 hours, for
yeah,
the whole shebang. But Guadalcanal stuck with him obviously because it was his baptism of fire.
first one.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
his first one exactly, and he experienced different things on Guadalcanal, and that's what's interesting about these Marine divisions that you see go through the war, but especially Second Marine Division and even like to an
mm,
extent First Marine Division. They go through different levels of climate. You know, you got the jungle on
yeah.
Guadalcanal, you got the rainforest on Cape Gloucester, you got the coral
Peleliu,
hellhole of Peleliu, and then
mm,
you've got the pastoral
Okinawa.
paradise of Okinawa. So it's literally different realms of the earth. But
Well,
he
luckily the
remarked,
Guadalcanal guys didn't experience
right,
Oki,
most of
so
them, yeah.
yeah,
But
they
he,
did three and they're out. Yeah, and
he,
then
he
they leave.
recalled that the heat and the rain and the mosquitoes and the terrible weather in Guadalcanal, that
Oh, the
stuck
heat
with
where they
him a
got him.
lot. Yeah,
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 imagine
yeah.
Ecuador up 10 degrees above the equator or below. Yeah, geez. Um, all right, we'll go to another one. Who else kind of sticks out?
Well, there's a couple of other ones, and both of these guys were actually really close friends during the war and after the war, and that's Frank Pomeroy and Art Pendleton. They were both H Company, Second Battalion, First. I think Art
You,
actually wound up getting transferred to a different company
you want to
afterwards.
do
But
art first?
yeah, we can do Art first. Yeah, um, Art Pendleton. He's got a really interesting story. I'm sure you're keenly aware of his story because he was there at the Elu River. He was a machine gunner, 1917, A1, water-cooled machine gun. And there he is. And he was a full-blooded Passamaquoddy Indian.
Oh,
And
wow. I didn't know
yeah,
that.
yeah, super. You know the movie Kelly's Heroes? And then you
Yeah,
got Oddball,
Hilton
who's
is
the,
oddball.
well, yeah,
He had an attitude like that.
yeah, he kind of
Oh,
did. Yeah, I
laid back.
saw very much. I saw pictures of him that he showed me from the early 1960s, and here's this combat veteran Marine from Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, and he's long haired, got the flowered shirt. He was a hippie, like a full scale,
Oh, yeah.
honest to God, yeah,
Cool.
yeah. But before all that,
Yeah,
before all that, Art was, as I said, he was a machine gunner in H Company two, H21.
yeah.
He talks about Tenor or Elu, Alligator Creek, whatever you want to call it. My trigger goes to Tenaroo River, even though I know that's the incorrect name. But he talked about that night, and he was in H Company from the beginning, like from when the company was formed, and they formed up at New River, and they went across the country on the steam train and got on the ship and went, and did the practice landing, all that stuff. He
Yep.
did all that stuff, and he talks about getting on line that night, during the Elu River battle. And I remember asking him because I wanted to hear all about it, And I said, what, what, what happened? What are you seeing? What's going on? What do you hear? And he even said, he said it all started like it just went up all of a sudden. He says they were behind the lines. He was because he was not on the line. He estimated he was about 50 yards behind the line, but he even said he's like, I don't know, it may have been more. I don't think it was any less than that, but he was close enough to where, as he said, if I stood up, I probably would have gotten killed by something flying through the air. So
This photo is from, sorry, this photo is from the 21st of August, or August 21st, 1921. So this is the day of the, sorry, yeah. No, this is the 20th or 21st, um, when the planes were coming in. So it's the
that would
20th.
be the 20th. Yeah, 20th.
Yep. So it's the 20th. This is the 20th. And where it says wire, you probably can't see, but if you zoom
Oh, you can
in,
see it. Yeah.
there's a number of Marines there at the mouth. Well, you can see where it goes into the ocean. There's a number of Marines there. They're putting in barbed wire. Um, so that's Pendleton's in this photo somewhere,
Somewhere.
um, somewhere in there. So this is the day before the actual fighting. So it's
So
about a pretty cool picture. Yep.
it is a very cool picture. When the defecation hits the ventilation, as we all know, the first guy to open fire on the American side, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Johnny Rivers. Um, Chief Rivers,
Well, the first one was some outpost, but yeah, I think
but the
once
machine gun
they
line, right?
yeah, machine gun line was Rivers. Where it said Schmidt machine gun on here, that's where Rivers is. That's
Right.
their machine gun post.
And he and Rivers were buddies. They were because they were both Native American, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I have no earthly clue, but they were both machine gunners. And he and Rivers were pals. They were like, Liberty buddies. And when Rivers gets killed and Schmidt gets blinded and their gun gets
And
shredded or
Diamond, yep,
whatever. Yeah, and
yeah,
Diamond gets wounded in the arms, if I remember correctly,
yeah. He
shoulders or
got shot
something.
in the arm, and Schmidt got blinded in the face, and Rivers was shot in the face and chest, killed.
Well, Art and his crew are called up to take Schmidt's place. So they go into Schmidt's position
Bunker, yeah,
and then take over that position. He did admit, he said by the time they got there, most of the fighting had started to kind of die down at that time. And they stayed there for the rest of the night into the morning. And he talked about they were as the sun rose, he says, as we all know, there's still fighting going on. It wasn't over. But the fighting now is a lot of it's on the other side of the river. It's over
yes.
there across the river.
Because
And he was
one's cleaning up, yeah.
well, he was doing this. This is not funny, but it was funny at the time. He said, they were told that anything that's moving on the other side of the river is probably Japanese, so go ahead and shoot it. So he's sitting there on his 1917 and he sees movement and he just starts opening up with his 1917. Well, as he's just cutting loose, somebody comes up, smacks him in the back of the head, and he turns around and he looks, and it's Colonel Pollock.
Oh yeah,
And
the battalion commander, yeah.
yeah, and Pollock tells him, "Stop your fucking shooting because there's Marines on the other side of that river." And he's like, "Well, we were told that, the Japanese over there." And he's like, "Well, maybe, but just so you know, you're shooting
Yeah.
at Marines." He's like, "Oh my God." But,
Yeah, because
it's
1-1 has done an envelopment. And they're sweeping around, so he probably wouldn't have saw 1-1 first time
I
first Marines coming in.
guarantee you he didn't see
No,
them. Guaranteed.
didn't he see Rivers? Almost stepped on Rivers. Is he the one that almost stepped on Rivers? Because Rivers had a
I
palm frond over him. They put a palm frond over him where it was blown out from either someone had thrown one on him because they pulled Rivers out of the bunker and laid him behind the bunker.
Yeah, yeah.
When he died, and I think they put a palm frond on over him, and I think Pendleton almost stepped on him,
It's
or him, or
possible.
whoever's with him. Potentially, he goes, "Oh, look," and almost stepped on Rivers. Who's that? And that's Rivers. And when he
Yeah,
went in there, the machine gun is bashed up, and the two guys are laying in the bottom of the hole, and the machine gun's
yeah,
flipped over and destroyed.
yep,
I
yep.
think I read his personal account. Is him or I'm pretty sure it's Pendleton, or yeah, Pendleton said that. So he paints a very vivid picture on that one.
It wouldn't surprise me at all because, like I said, he was the one that was ordered to take over that
Yeah,
bunker, over to take over that position. So yeah, I mean, he was there through the rest of the event. He talks about too, which a lot of them do, is when the fighting was done. When it was done, and there's this famous footage of those Marines walking up and down the beach, right
yeah.
there with all the bodies out there. And he's one of those Marines somewhere in that footage, or he's one of those guys walking through there because he even said that he's like, I remember him saying that there were certain aspects of the combat that you remember and certain aspects of the combat that you purposely, like your mind,
Oh,
shuts off, and he says, but that's one thing that even I wish my mind had shut off, but it didn't, because he
yeah,
remembered walking through there and seeing there's just heaps of bodies all over the
yeah,
place that were
yeah.
shredded by 37 millimeter canister fire, machine gun fire, rifle fire, mortars, whatever, what have you. And he says it looked like, I remember him telling me it looked like a butcher shop. He said it was just meat everywhere in there.
Well, and there's a thing about that, which a lot of people, those famous photos you see, and the bodies are pretty much intact. Well, Sewell was the division's
Yeah.
photographic officer. Well, my friend spoke to Sewell about it, interviewed him, all these different photos, and he'd tell when and where and all the background. And Sewell said he wasn't allowed to take the photos of the mangled bodies, which was, if you look at the photos, he's facing basically west up the beach. You never see any photos of the sandbar. And he wasn't allowed to take the photos of the sandbar. And that comes from a guy called Colonel James, who was the division chief of staff at the time, because you got to remember, it's the very beginning. And
Right.
he said, those pictures would be too graphic. You don't need to take photos of them. That would be just too graphic. We're not allowed to take photos of graphic. Once again, it's early in the war. Later, it's
Right.
no problem. But Sewell didn't. And what was a bad thing, too, some of the, not going to say bad, but unfortunate, some of the photos and the footage, he took a lot more, not so much of the sandbar, and it was put on a ship. And uh, that ship was later lost. No, sorry, I'm getting backtracking. He had a lot of footage on day one of the landing,
Mm.
and it was aboard the Quincy, I think. He
Oh, the
sent all the
prisoner. Yeah.
photos. He sent it to the Quincy. Then it went down on Savo Island,
Yeah.
2 days later. So a lot of photos. He said, yeah, had great lot of film footage. He had some color photos, apparently, footage.
Mm.
And it went
Yeah.
down on the Quincy. So, you got another one you can think of?
Yeah, Pomeroy, Frank Pomeroy. I knew Pomeroy, and he and Art were right buddy buddy. They were
Well, he's
pals.
another one, 2-1, Hotel 2-1.
Yep, yep.
Yep.
Pomeroy was another one. He was my buddy. I knew Frank for a long time. I still know his daughter Karen. I still talk to her via Facebook every once in a blue moon. But he was a really really good dude. Had this hardcore Boston accent. I mean, yard and all this. Let's go to the yard, go down the hall, all this stuff. Just an incredibly cool dude. Um, he was another young one. If I remember correctly, when he joined up, he was
You
he
see
was
how
like
young he looks here.
yeah, he's a kid. And this is
Recruit for him.
after. Oh wait, no, that's his recruit photo. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So he was like 17 years old when he gets in,
Mm.
and he'd actually, of course, they're going across on a George F. Eliot, and
Mm.
as we know, the George F. Eliot gets sunk, it gets hit, and it gets sunk, and his platoon sergeant. I can't remember his name. And again, I'm pulling this straight off of memory, so forgive me. But
Yeah.
his platoon sergeant was like, "Look, you're just a kid. You don't need to go on here, because this is in the initial opening, like literally the day of. They're thinking they're going to take heavy fire, blah blah blah, and
Oh
you
yeah.
come in later in the afternoon, and Frank was all pissed off because he's like, God damn it, I'm
Yeah.
here
Of
to do
course.
this,
Yeah. My
it's
buddies.
yeah." And he gets left on the George F. Eliot with him, two other guys, and the damn George F. Eliot gets hit, sunk. And of
Ironic.
course,
Yeah.
his company doesn't take any fire on D-Day. So it's like, guy was trying to protect me, and I damn near die on the stupid ship. So he
Yeah.
he
Well,
gets eventually gets ashore in a very roundabout way, but he gets ashore and he meets up with the company. I swear to God, if I remember correctly, he told me like the day before the
hmm.
Elu River battle. And he was out there as well, and he was trained in heavy weapons. And when he was training at New River in North Carolina, he was training on the 37 millimeter as well as the machine guns and things like that.
Yeah.
And he remembered he gave a vivid description. And I know there were, you know this better than I do. There were a bunch of dudes who operated those 37 millimeters at the mouth of the river. I mean, there were
Oh yeah. Yeah.
several guys that rolled in and rolled out. Some guys got killed there, but there were several
Yeah.
guys that rolled in and rolled out. He
The
was one
infantry
of
guys. Yeah.
those, huh?
Yeah. The infantry
Yeah.
guys. Yeah. There were two guns. So initially there was one gun. There was one facing the ocean for anti-boat defense. And then had another one actually facing the sandbar. And during the fighting, they rolled one of them out from that beach defense and faced it toward the sandbar. But the one facing the sandbar, the crew got taken out.
Mhm.
There was an infantry, I think it was G and H.
Yeah.
I guess it was one him. And they'd rotate through, like you said, the infantry guys that knew how to fire that thing.
Yeah. And I remember him saying, and again, it paints up one of those vivid memories in your mind. He'd say, because I asked him, I said, you're on this giant shotgun. what, because that's what it is, you know?
Oh yeah,
It's
yeah.
like,
128 pellets of
yeah,
buckshot.
about that big around too. You know,
Yeah.
what are
I
you
mean,
seeing? And he's like, we wouldn't see anything. He says, you didn't see any. And they were given, apparently, when he got up there later in the evening, or I guess in the morning, technically, they were starting to run low on ammunition. And he was given the orders, or his crew was given the orders, the Marines that were at the gun, do not shoot unless you see something to shoot at.
yeah.
And he said that they had gotten at one point, the Japanese had gotten close enough to the weapon to where they could see them. And he said there was a group of them there and they pulled the trigger, for lack of a better
Trigger.
term,
Yeah.
on a 37. And I said, well, what happened next? He said they were gone.
It wasn't there.
They were just
Yeah.
gone. He
Was
said
100. Yeah. Well, it fires 128. Each round fires 128, basically buckshot size, about 30 to 35 caliber. So it is a giant shotgun. I don't know what 37 millimeter would be gauge, but who knows?
huge,
It's,
big.
yeah. I mean, they used them. I mean, that was one of the most versatile weapons they used on Guadalcanal. In fact,
They
they
used
started
those all
using
through the
them.
war. You know?
Yeah, well, they started using them in Guadalcanal, the clear brush initially, because the Japanese, especially around Point Cruz area, had the coral bunkers. They call them igloo bunkers, made of coral rock, and they had so much camouflage with vegetation over them. What they would do, they'd pull them in. The first shot would canister and just shred all the vegetation so they could see the bunkers. Then they'd start pumping in rounds with them. So that, and as you know, was it in Gloucester,
Mhm.
Waltz Hill, they carried that 37 up there with
Yep.
Walt pushing it, help pushing it. And it was just a great little weapon. But
Yeah.
so Pendleton, no, Pendleton, sorry,
Pomeroy.
Pomeroy, he's been on a number of videos I've seen, like through YouTube
Mhm.
and shows, but he he discusses his Peleliu. And he had a
Yeah.
pretty, well, they all had pretty harrowing experience on Peleliu, but there's a photo, and do you think that photo is actually him? There's a famous photo out there, him doing like this. There's a Marine like that, and blood all over
Yeah, I
his
know
leg.
exactly what you're talking about.
Is that
And
him?
sorry, so here's the
He
thing.
says it is, but I don't know. It's hard.
It's hard to say because you can't see his face.
I see the face. Yeah.
You can't
And the
see
guy
his
had
face.
BAR mags. If you remember, he had BAR mags.
He did, and he had BAR mags, but if you also look in that photograph, there's an M1 there. There's a
Okay.
Garand like leaning up on a rock or a log or something. You could just barely see it, but it's there.
Yeah.
And I remember
That's
him
what it
telling
is.
me that at that time, even though he was still H company, still heavy weapons company, he was at that time they got rid of the 17s and they had 1919 A4s. They had the
Yeah. Small.
Browning, the air cooled.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, he picked up an M1. He had an M1 and he had an M1 also. He was manning a 1919 at Cape Gloucester. He was manning an A4 at Cape Gloucester at
Mm,
Coffin Corner on Cape Gloucester. He was
yeah.
manning an A4 when the Japanese came up the hill in the middle of that monsoon. And he
Yeah.
was just mowing them down with his A4. So anyway, when he gets to Pavuvu, he wanted to ditch the machine gun because he was sick and tired of humping it. But he was still, and yeah, because he wasn't a
Yeah.
big dude. Like he was a
I,
little guy.
yeah.
He was a little
I
bitty
mean,
guy. I mean, I'm 6'1" and he came up to about my shoulder, I mean, he was a little bitty
only
dude.
small guys get the guns.
Absolutely. And he wasn't a like big boy, he was like a little bitty dude. And
Yeah.
he wanted to ditch the A4 because he was sick of humping it, but he was still part of
Yeah.
the crew. Regardless of this, he winds up picking up an M1 on Peleliu, and he carried an M1 on Peleliu. He was still part of the crew. And I remember him telling me, he said, I picked up a BAR belt because it could hold more end block
More.
clips,
Yeah.
which makes sense because
Yeah.
it could. Now, whether or not that image is him or not, I don't know. But the way he
But it's,
describes
I
the
wish I had
things
that
that
image here, but I don't have it. Yeah.
I do, and I can put it in the video here.
Yeah. Do that.
Um, but the way he describes how he gets wounded that night or what happens that night, if you look at that picture, yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
things that happened to him are all
He gets
over
pulled
this
out.
dude.
He gets pulled out too after that. They have to take his photo and all that. And they said,
Yes.
I think his commander said, you need to get out of here or whatever. We're
Yeah.
pulling you out because he's wounded. He's walking wounded.
Yeah.
He's got a knife. He said he had like a bayonet wound or knife wound and shrapnel
So
wounds. And
exactly. So that night, what happens there, theoretically, when that picture's taken, is the following morning. So that night, he's up on the line, and they're told to watch for infiltrators and all this, the
yeah,
standard SOP. And he hears something out in front of him, and again, just shoots
yeah,
immediately. And as he shoots a Japanese officer who had a samurai sword who had a katana. And the guy, when he comes down, he shoots this dude right up through the bottom of the jaw, blows the
Mm,
top of his head out. And he talks about this. And when a
yeah,
guy comes down on him, because he's looking up, he's in a hole or a
yeah,
depression, because, Peleliu, there are no holes. And he's looking
yeah,
up at him. And when a guy falls down on him, all the blood from the top of his head pours on top of Frank into his mouth and everything else,
yeah,
all
yeah,
down his helmet. And the guy still got the sword and falls on him, and he slices right through his knee, right through his, like, the top of his, like, just above his kneecap with the sword, and tears through his pants and everything else. Well, if you look at the picture,
yeah. He's got a
the
yeah.
dude's got blood all over his helmet. He's got a big slice through his knee. And I
His
mean, the
blood all
dude,
over his pants. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And
and
I
I've seen
mean,
the colored version, and it's pretty. It really brings
pretty
the la-
graphic.
it's such a great photo. Um,
So, I mean, it could be
if
him.
it's him or not, it's still a great. It's a great photo. But I mean, yeah, probably there's on the balance probability, it's probably him.
I would
From all
agree.
the
Yeah.
you
I
take all
would
the
say
supporting
that,
evidence.
I'd say that it's probably a 75 to 80% chance that it is most certainly him,
Yeah,
because of the way he describes the things that happened to him. And if you look at the cat in the picture,
yeah,
it's very evident that those very same things happened to that dude. And for him to say, I want this picture to be of me, that's malarkey. He
yeah.
wouldn't have done that. He wasn't that kind of
But
a guy.
a lot of times out there, when a lot of people sees a photo and know it's granddad or dad or that's me,
Exactly.
it's no,
Exactly.
you wouldn't even in that well, but
Yeah.
such a great thing. Do you want to do another one? Have you got another time? If you think for another one,
Um, I don't know who else we got. I forgot all the list I sent you, to be perfectly frank with you. I forgot all the people I sent.
so you've got
But talking about Pomeroy though, before we get off of the subject of
yeah,
Pomeroy,
yeah,
this is interesting. I always thought it was interesting. So he did well after the war, career wise, he did well, and he was able to go back to Guadalcanal. He went back to Guadalcanal in like the early 80s. He actually went back 2 or 3 times.
oh wow, I didn't
And
know that.
yeah, and he tells a story, or he told a story, rest his soul. He told a story that he was there like in the early to mid 80s. I don't remember what year. I want to say
Yeah,
83. I don't know why that sticks in my head. I could be wrong, but regardless, he's in a hotel and he hears a knock on the door. He opens the door and it's like two Japanese standing there. And he's like, "What's up with
time
this?"
time to get on it on round two.
Yeah, he's like, "Okay." And apparently, one of these Japanese, there was a group of Japanese there that were trying to find the bodies from Tenerife
Yeah,
River, the Japanese bodies that were like pushed in the hole by the
yeah, I know this story. Yeah,
bulldozers,
good story. Yeah,
And so the Japanese start asking, hey, is there anybody who knows where these guys are? Blah, 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 da, 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 the whole story. And Frank just happened to be on the island. He's like, well, I don't know if he knows, but there's an American who was in the Marines who was on here during the battle, and maybe he knows. So they go to Frank, and Frank's like, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do know where those guys are because I watched them bury them.
yeah, yeah. That's it.
So he says the next morning he takes these guys out there to that area, and they start poking around down there, and damn sure if they don't start digging up and they start pulling up like boots or parts of
Yeah,
boots and things like that. And it is one of the areas where
yeah.
Ichiki's people were buried. And they Japanese didn't know, but Frank knew because he watched them do it. He
I
watched
think it
them,
was 83 or 84. I've
something
got a
like that.
newspaper article, and where the Ichiki Memorial is today is right over the top of that pit. There's
Yeah.
apparently two more pits there, but yeah, that was. And then I've got a photo of the um, in a funeral pyre, cremation pyre, with all the
Hmm.
bones and the skulls and stuff. And the article actually says the Marine veterans um, helped them locate
Yeah.
them on the island. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean
Yeah.
they definitely know where they were.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, today that's a gravel pit. So it's a gravel company. It just
Yeah.
turned the area. It's destroyed the battlefield, and probably there's mixed Japanese bones in the concrete of the new stadium somewhere. Who knows? But
I'm sure.
and there was two more pits still there. I think they pulled
Yeah.
about 80 or 90 out of that pit.
Yeah. I don't
Off the top
know,
of my head.
but,
But that's pretty good for him to do that.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. He was a good dude. He was a good guy. He
did he go
became,
out with them? Did he say? Sorry.
yeah, no, he did. Like he brought
Oh,
them
wow.
out there the next morning because I remember him saying this, and this
Did he
apparently
see him
stuck
dig
with
them
him.
up? Yeah.
Say again?
Did he see them dig the bodies up or the remains?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
because he was telling the guy I remember him saying there was an older guy and a younger guy. There was a
Yeah.
guy probably in his like his 50s or something, and the guy like in his 20s or 30s. And he said, "Yeah, I know where those guys are because we buried, hundreds of them in this hole." and he didn't, but he watched guys, hundreds of guys get buried in
Yeah,
this
yeah.
hole. And he
It was
said
mainly career labor.
the
Yeah.
younger Japanese like started to like smirk, like as if like, yeah, sure. And he
Mm.
said he remembered this. The older Japanese turned around and smacked him, like, shut up. Like literally, like, shut your mouth, you know? So
Yeah.
the next morning they
People
bring him out
dishonored
there.
each other.
Frank,
Yeah.
yeah, you're being a jerk, you know?
Yeah.
So Frank brings him out there and it's like, dig here. And they start digging there. And sure enough, they're pulling bones and, as I
It's
said,
pretty
like
good to
pieces of
remember it
boots and
after
stuff out.
because the terrain would have been changed because in that stage in the 80s, in fact, the Americans, even in 43, knocked most of the trees down. So if you, they turned into a base. In fact, the engineers and stuff where the ordnance guys was in there, it was pretty
Mhm.
good for him to go. I guess he could look at his position and say, well, there and there and there. That's all he had
And
to
I
do
think
was
that,
go back to where he was at and go,
yeah,
even though the trees aren't there, it was in this area.
somewhere in that area. Yeah. And
Yeah.
he talked about that for years afterwards. And he was,
Oh, wow.
I
It's one,
think he felt pretty good about that because he
yeah,
helped
of course.
them bring their people home, you know, and he had no
Yeah.
animosity to the Jap. No, well, he did during the war. I'm sure he did. But
Yeah.
after the war, he had no animosity to those people at all.
Yeah. I mean, they were at that stage, you probably, they just,
People.
poor
Yeah.
dumb grunts, infantrymen, just like I was, and
Just like him.
yeah. And as you get older, you get a little more sentimental, and you need to say, look, they need a proper burial, so that would have probably gave him a bit of closure too, I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. He was a good dude.
Or he'd be like a typical Marine, he'd be going, oh, chance for souvenirs. So if I grab me a sword or pistol out of
Well,
here,
ironically enough, you should mention that is that
yeah,
when they
I
started
know
pulling
Marines.
stuff out of the hole, he found a boot. As I said, it was like a leather boot.
Yeah,
And he picked the boot up and he said, and I remember him saying this, he said like it was perfectly preserved. It looked like it had been put there yesterday. And he said
yeah, yeah.
he took it out and he's like, I'm bringing this home. And he
You
brought
can
it
have a
with
foot in
him,
it.
put it in his hotel room. And the next morning, I guess from just have it been in the salt water and the
Mm.
mud and
Smell.
everything else, it was preserved. Well, the next day it had dried out. And he says he went to grab it and it just literally fell apart.
Oh,
He's like, well,
yeah,
there you
yeah,
go.
probably. As
So, so get no
long as you didn't have a
souvenirs for
foot in it,
me.
that's what I'm saying. Imagine
Uh,
going through customs. Wait,
yeah,
what's
that
in
wouldn't
this
have been
boot?
good. Yeah,
You know how they
that wouldn't
check
have
for
been good.
soil on your boots?
Yeah,
Oh, there's
yeah,
some bones in here. Anyway,
yeah.
sorry. That's my Marine humor coming out. Who's the next guy?
I'll
One
be
more,
honest.
you think?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember who all I sent you. I
You've got
remember,
Frank
oh, Frank
uh,
Gadone. Yeah, Frank
Gadon or
Gadone.
Ben Quintana.
Ben Quintana. Yeah,
You just got
those are
those two.
Raiders. Yeah, Quintana was a Raider, of course, and so was Gadone. Gadone was he was B Company, if I remember correctly, wasn't he? God, it's been years.
Gadon.
Yeah,
I'll have to. He's definitely Raiders. I think he might have been B Company. I
yeah.
don't. Let me see off the top of my head.
Because
Um,
if I remember correctly, he's again, I mean,
in
we're
20s.
talking 20 years now. Uh, he was the guy that gave me Sweeney's contact information, so I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure.
and plus he was pretty big into the Raider Association. I mean, he's
Yeah,
very he does a lot of writing. Wrote for Raider Patch. He was one of the well-known uh, Raiders after the war. He was
yeah,
sharing stories and things like that. So he would have probably known a few other
yeah,
ones. Let's see if I can
yeah.
pull his picture up.
Quintana was he was another Raider. He was from Mississippi, and I actually didn't interview Quintana. Quintana was interviewed by a guy who works down the hall with me, Tommy Lofton. I work for him now. He worked for me at World War II Museum, and Tommy, part of my role at World War II Museum is I didn't interview people. I had to go through their oral histories to find out which ones were potentially the best to put in the galleries. And I remember going through Quintana's and listening to the whole shebang. And he lost his eye on Edson's Ridge. If I remember correctly, he took grenade shrapnel or he took shrapnel in his
Yes.
eye and lost his eye on on the ridge. And he was one of the first Marines to come back to the South. Now, not the U.S., but the South. In terms of he came to New Orleans and then he came to Mississippi. There's Godone there. Yeah,
Let's get
yeah,
on. Sorry. Yep.
yeah. No, that's Godone. Yeah,
Get
that's
on. I'll get Ben. And I'll show you Ben.
that's what Godone looked like when I met him.
Yeah, I was
But
going. I couldn't get a other picture of him.
Quintana comes home he goes to New Orleans because that's was the closest naval base was New Orleans, was my hometown, of course. And then he gets
There's good. There
there he
he is.
is.
There with his
Yeah,
patch.
yeah. And he gets sent back home to Mississippi, and he's medically discharged for obvious reasons. pretty soon after he gets home, and he's one of the first Marines, combat Marines from Guadalcanal to come back to the southeastern portion of the United States. And I say this because his name's in a lot of the newspapers because he was one of the first guys to come back.
This is
And
the newspaper shot up, I think.
well, there you go. Yeah.
With his friend, a friend, I think, or maybe brother. I don't know who he is, but he is.
Frankly,
Only
I couldn't tell. It's a sailor for sure. That much I know.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, so he's one of the first Marine combat veterans to come back to this general southeastern portion of the country, of which you are intimately familiar with as well.
yeah, yeah,
And he's interviewed by a lot of the local newspapers and even some of the non-local newspapers because they wanted to get the story from the horse's mouth. You know, what is going on in Guadalcanal? What is it like? So
yeah. Of
he
course.
actually becomes kind of a sort of quasi celebrity when he comes back home, which was the last thing on earth he wanted to do. And
It's
all he
like
wanted to
John
do once he
Barcelona.
say again.
Sounds like a Barcelona. You do a war bonds tour. I don't want to do that, but yeah,
Exactly. I mean, not obviously not to that degree, but yeah,
yeah,
similar. And once he gets medically discharged out of the Marines, which is during the war, because he's, got one friggin' eye.
yeah.
He goes to school and he becomes a pharmacist in Mississippi, and he ran his
Becomes
pharmacy till
successful, don't he? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I was reading an
He,
article about him, I guess from the '80s, and yeah, he was a pharmacist, and he was a kind of a
mhm,
very leading community figure.
yeah. Yeah,
You can
he
just
was a
see how
pharmacist when Tommy went to go interview him. He interviewed him in his pharmacy, so
Mississippi. Yeah.
he still ran his
What part of
pharmacy
Mississippi?
until
You remember?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Not Macomb.
No, no,
That's
but
got Macomb. Like maybe I'm thinking about Jerry Clower.
I don't know. I don't know.
Macomb, Mississippi. Do you know Jerry Clower?
Jerry Clower. Why is that name
Remember the
familiar
famous
to me?
comedian?
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. My dad used to listen to him. Sorry, I got sidetracked.
yeah.
Um,
But honestly, I don't remember anymore. God, it's been years. It's been years.
I'll
But
have
yeah, he still had his pharmacy, and Tommy went and interviewed him in the damn pharmacy that he'd had since, I don't know, probably like
yeah.
1948 or whatever. But yeah, another super cool guy, super nice Raider, hardcore dude. He was a young guy too when he joined the Raiders, if I remember correctly. He was only 17.
Yeah, they actually because I looked at his muster roll. He was in April 42 boot camp. So a lot of these
Mhm.
guys, the real junior boot guys, were in the January. I call them the Pearl Harbor recruits. This guy was April,
Mhm.
and that leads me to think, how did he make the Raiders? But I think he was what Edson's guys would do, like in the first Raiders, they were assisting. I think in around that time in April, May, they went to Quantico and they were assisting some of the recruits. I think they sent them from Paris Island um, to do some shooting in Quantico. I think after they got out of Paris Island, and what they would do is they would serve as rifle coaches, and it was a bit of a screening at the same
Ah,
time. So if they picked, they said, "Well, this boot has Raider material," and then they tap me on the shoulder and they'd go, go speak to the bit of a selection they had there. So I knew they were doing that. Potentially, he might have been one of those guys they tapped on the shoulder and they recognized because once again, April, he'd only been what April, what May, June, July, August,
he'd
September,
have been around
five
for
months,
5 months.
5 months,
Yeah,
less than
yeah,
6 months.
yeah.
And that's even junior, the January guy. So yeah, it would have been
Yeah,
good quality for him to be tapped on the shoulder like that and put in the first Raiders. Such a young junior Marine.
and that's important to note. That I'm glad you said that. As you said, the Pearl Harbor Marines, and exactly like you were talking
Good
about
quality,
earlier. Hmm? What's that?
excellent quality.
Oh yeah, yeah,
The
for
Pearl
sure.
Harbor Marines, one officer said, "Look, they only gave him 5 weeks basic training. They cut the recruit training down to 5 weeks, and they expanded it later. So we had wartime was, 8 to 12 weeks, and then that recruit class only had 5 weeks training, and then they said that's not enough, and went to 8 weeks and then 12 by the end of the war. But that recruit class, one officer says, um, what
Motivated, man.
they made in quality. He said a lot of these guys are officer material. Because at that stage, it didn't until 43 that the Marine Corps started doing the selective service from the draft, picking
Right.
guys from the draft. Before that, it was all volunteers. So these were the most idealistic, youngest,
Hmm.
wanted to go, and they put their hands up, and they're the best quality. That's why you don't see too many Marines. That's one good thing, not good thing. One thing I use to assess photos is, this is a Marine or this is U.S. Army. In World War II, obviously you got you got the uniforms, you got the helmet covers
Sure.
and other stuff. But one thing I look for, especially when enlisted men, is glasses, eyeglasses.
Mm-hmm.
You won't see many Marines,
Got to have perfect vision.
enlisted guys with eyeglasses, because that was one of the things that would disqualify them from the Marine Corps. Was eyesight. They couldn't wear glasses.
Yeah.
There's only very, very rarely you'll see, but in the Army they could wear glasses for enlisted.
And you got to think too, you know, those guys that joined after Pearl Harbor, of which, you know, Sid Phillips was one, you know,
Pendleton,
Richard
all of them.
Greer was one, Pendleton was one. Richard Greer, that's another Guadalcanal Marine I knew quite well. He served with
The
Basilone.
17. Yeah, 17 career.
Yeah, he served with Basilone. He was there at the Anderson Field
Company
battle.
runner. He was a
But
company runner.
he all these guys joined in January 1942. So you talk about motivated, that's some
Pearl Harbor.
motivated Marines right there, brother.
And unfortunately, you know, I always say when I talk about Guadalcanal in that class too, and a lot of them went into the 1st Marines, a lot of them went to the 5th Marines, because they kept using the 5th and 1st to form cadres, and they kept robbing them. Not robbing them, they just kept stripping them. And that's why they were put in these fresh recruits. So with Operation Lone Wolf, that was the whole thing, that the division was going to go for New Zealand for 6 months. Yeah, they were right before they left. They were kitted out. The 1st Marine Division had the priority of all equipment for the U.S. Armed Forces, because they knew these guys were shipping out to go fight. So that's how they got the new helmets and the uniforms, and they still had the O3s, but that's another story. And then they shipped them out, and they'd have a chance to try out some of these weapons, break in these new weapons. So what they were going to do was 5 weeks basic training. They gave them a little bit of training in April and May, and then they shipped them out to New Zealand to be there for 6 months. So one, they were going to garrison New Zealand, which is the New Zealand government like that. And 2, they were going to do training, have a full 6-month training package. But as we know, they as soon as they arrived, especially the 1st Marines, as soon as the 1st Marines arrived, they already knew they were going to be going in. So they just had time to sit there and unload and load. And that's all they did. And they got a little bit of training on the ships. But when these guys went in, they were really half trained, and many of them were buried in the uniform they was issued at boot camp in. Yeah, so that's, you look at it that way.
But you know,
any of the Guadalcanal guys, mostly junior guys, coming in January.
Well, and you look at those guys, you know, we did the Peleliu episodes together on my show. You, me, and Bill, we did the Peleliu episodes. And at that time, September 1944, 1st Marine Division, you know, of course, the people, 82nd Airborne, whatever, man. I'm talking about the Pacific.
I'm with you.
1st Marine Division was the finest light infantry division in the American Armed Forces, period. And that's not Seth Paridon saying that. That's the United States military saying that in September 1944. And as you know, a lot of the cadre that's in 1st MarDiv in September 1944, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are these Pearl Harbor Marines. A lot of them are these guys that were at the canal, you know, and they're, what's that?
A third of the division?
Yeah.
A third of the division were Guadalcanal and Gloucester.
Yeah.
The other third was Gloucester, and the last third was
recruits. Yeah.
And as you know, at that stage, they'd got through all the old NCOs and the unfit NCOs and the lackluster NCOs and officers, and the cream of the crop had already risen.
Yeah, you got the baddest of the bad right here, right now. You know, and these are the guys that joined after Pearl. I mean, obviously there's some that were there before Pearl. You know, some of the officers for sure, and some of the higher, you know, some of the older NCOs. You know, but
they got rid of some of those.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, you read, you know, the old breed and you know how they're all great. Yeah, there were a lot of great old breed, and some of those old breeds wasn't so great. And Merrill Twining, which was the planning officer division, in his memoir, he basically said, what did he say? In 1st Marines, he got a lot of these guys, these old NCOs, who they pulled out from shipyards and barracks from God knows where. And he says some of them couldn't organize what did he say? A Boy Scout hot dog cook-up or something like that. That's what he said in his book. But, you know, a lot of those guys got, just like the National Guard, some of the National Guard units, some of the older ones are,
it's shipped out.
Some of the regulars. I mean, look at the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. I hate using his name, but Maxwell. I mean, he was the one that Colonel Hunt, at Vandergrift, they fired in the field and he relieved him. Instant dismissal. So anyway, so it is. You go back to those January recruits, and it's like, wow, those guys did a lot.
They
from
did.
what they what they were trying to do. But they had some good leadership and stuff, and it was great for them. They scored a break with Alligator Creek that they were able to. Their first real big fight was they were in defensive positions, and they had some good NCOs and some officers, some guys behind them, but they had the whole benefit of modern arms and behind bunkers.
Right.
But then you look at some of the units, especially on Guadalcanal, in their first fight. If you look at some of the Army guys, they were thrown straight into the meat grinder on offensive combat, and they suffered for it. You would have seen it replicated in Europe in the first combat, when offensive combat, because it's more deadlier and more complex. More
You
offensive
see that.
operation.
You see that when you go through, especially through the Solomons campaign, like through Bougainville and places like that, where the National Guard units, you talk about National Guard and New Guinea as
Well, the
well.
43rd, yeah, in
Yeah,
Munda,
they're
yeah.
throwing National Guard units in there, and I mean,
Oh, the
they were
32nd,
not the best trained units that there were, and and their initial record shows that. I mean, you got battalion commanders, you got regimental commanders, you got divisional commanders being relieved, not
yeah,
even to mention company commanders and below,
yeah,
platoon commander. A lot of guys are getting killed. A lot of guys are, they're not physically prepared for this. And it's usually after these guard units get into combat for, several weeks or even a month or two or more, that they start to weed out the dead wood and move up into the higher echelon of combat efficiency. And it's the same thing here, first Mardivs. And that's why I say September 44, these are the baddest dudes on the planet, period.
mm.
No
I wouldn't
question.
call it a lot division either.
Well, yeah, true. But
Well,
it's
I
also,
even say, we're getting a bit off track here, but I even say when the First Marine Division, because you hear these stories about, they were ill-equipped, and when the First Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in August 42, they were the most, of all the U.S. Armed Forces divisions, they're the strongest and most heavily armed division in the U.S. Armed Forces at the time. Because you got to remember, they're the first amphibious division America ever formed, but they have a lot of extras, a lot of add-ons.
mhm.
You've got their own tank battalion, artillery regiment. You've got engineers, or two different engineers. You got pioneers, engineers. You got raiders. You got a whole para battalion.
Yeah,
Um, you've got a special weapons battalion. Other than an armor division, there was no other powerful division in the world, or in America's world, in August 42.
yeah,
And that's not a debate, really. That's easily
yeah.
proved, because they
And
were
they, and they,
so
and they keep
souped
they
up.
keep
They
that
had
straight.
20,000 men. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
they keep that straight. They land on Peleliu, they're like 20,000 plus,
Well, they have to
over
be the
over
amphibious division.
strength, yeah, over
They
strength
have to be.
division.
Amphibious division has all these
So,
different extras, attachments, cool attachments added on. All
and
right, I
they
think that's really, we've covered everyone there, Seth, that we really were looking
There's
to
more.
do.
There's more. Like I
Of
said,
course.
I didn't even think of Greer until I started, and that was another character there. We could talk about him another day, but Richard Greer, he was Bassilone's buddy, and there's pictures of him and Basilone when
Oh,
Basilone
yeah. In Melbourne,
receives.
all right.
Yeah, when I can't remember if he's already received word that he's getting the medal or he'd already received the medal, but he is smashed, and he's Bassilone's like blasted drunk, and it's very evident in the photographs. And there's Richard Greer, like, hey, holding him up and everything. But yeah, he was another one. He was a cool cat.
What I wanted to do, I was going to share this photo. I mean, I don't know if all the viewers have seen it, but this is Edson's Ridge. Um, so this is one of my, I think, best photos that depicts Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. This wasn't the time of the battle. It's actually taken in the 70s, but the terrain looks exactly the way it was in 1942. So where the picture of the dead Japanese are, that was basically Sweeney's middle spur.
Hmm.
So where the little yellow dot is, if you just go up, say toward the airfield, on the reverse slope of that, right near the road, was where Sweeney's CP was. And on the right hand side was where C Company, that little spur was where C Company Power was. But Sweeney's company went to the left, down that little spur and into the jungle. And then you can see Edson's CP there.
Hmm.
And you can see why the Japanese said, I'll go straight. That's the best way. It's
Oh
a
yeah.
finger pointing straight to the airfield. So the airfield's up top.
Yeah.
Then you get through that thick jungle. That's
touch
one of
and
the best.
go, man. Touch
Yeah,
and
one of
go.
the best photos I think to actually portray or depict the battle.
Absolutely.
Pretty cool. All right. Any final words? I guess you could think about these guys in
Oh
general.
man. I don't know.
I
Like I
wonder if
said, I
there's
mean,
any of them left. Is any? Do you know if any's left?
none of the guys that I knew are still alive. None of the
Yeah,
guys from Guadalcanal that I knew are still around. And I'll be frank with you. I'd have to really sit here and think if any of the guys that I knew are still alive at all. I think there's maybe two or three right now that I
yeah,
can think of, and they're not even Pacific guys. They're European theater guys.
yeah. It's
Um,
unfortunately so. They're all leaving us.
the pickings are slim nowadays. Yeah, and they were just super cool human beings. They were.
Yeah,
We say this all the time, greatest generation. I don't buy into that crap. These were dudes. Any generation would have done the same thing, facing the same circumstances, in my opinion.
yeah,
But
and
these
that's
were guys.
and today's generation would too. No matter what people
That's
say.
that's that's what I'm talking about.
I mean, the
And
Roman
these
Roman legion said the same about their generations. It
exactly,
goes
man.
back
And they
human
were
nature.
put in an extraordinary situation, and they were brought up hard. And these are kids. These are children who grew up, or they were children during the Great Depression. So they were harder than you or me, or they just were because they lived in a different time. The United States in 1936 was not the United States right now. I mean, hell, half the damn rural population didn't have electricity. So I mean, these guys grew up hard. They did, and that certainly made them a different breed of cat. But these are your grandfathers, man, yeah, or your
Yeah,
fathers or your
just like
uncles
talking
or
to your grandfather.
whatever the case may be. And they were extraordinary people. They really were. They were, for the most part, incredibly humble. Didn't acknowledge, their role in anything other than, yeah, I was there. And I remember I used to have the hardest time trying to convince them to talk about themselves because they wanted to talk about their company or their
Yeah, of course.
ship or
Humble.
whatever, or squadron or whatever the case may be. And I was like, I can get that history. I want to hear what you did. Well, I really didn't do too much. Well, you got a silver star, so you kind of did something. So let's, or a Navy Cross, or you've got three Navy Crosses. So let's
Yeah,
hear about what you did. Okay, but they were just humble, just cool dudes. They really were. And some of them were a riot, but I mean, they were just really, really good people.
yeah.
And
And
it
they
was a
said they're
pleasure to
human.
know them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're just humans. Um,
Yep.
well, my grandfather, um, he didn't like that term "greatest generation." I mean, and I always say people say "greatest generation." I can see that, but I say, your greatest generation had the slackers and cowards too, just like
Sure
every
they did.
generation. I said, ask any World War II vet about the slackers and cowards; they'll tell you in a heartbeat. My grandfather used to talk about them all the time. The slackers that would sit back at home and didn't fight, or
Yep.
he got out of fighting, or the cowards who were in the fighting. So humans are humans. I always think back to the lost generation, the Great War generation, the World War I generation. I mean, they
Yep.
lived through a major world war and they lived through the Depression, and they lived through the Depression as adults who had to
Yep.
fend for their family
Yep.
responsibilities. But no one thinks about those guys.
Yep.
And then you look at the Civil War generation. I mean, if you look
Yep.
at any American generation, look what they suffered for. So yeah, yeah, all these are ordinary men living extraordinary times. I think
That's
one
it.
guy described it to me, and they stepped up just like in every generation. They got people, men and women, who step up to do what needs to be get done.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there
Absolutely.
always will be. Thank goodness for that. There we can jump off our soapbox.
I could go on for that for a while, but
Oh, me too. Good job. We get censored if we talk about the greatest generation. I mean, my God, you
indeed.
mention that, it's like, oh my God, you're so
Yeah.
bad.
You don't know what you're
Yeah,
talking about. My dad was a green. Calm
yeah,
yourself, okay?
yeah. I
Just
hear it all.
every day.
I bet you
Every
do.
day.
Um,
But anyway.
so we'll do this part. If someone say Seth, if someone really wants to tap into to these, I mean, you mentioned before at the National WW2 Museum where these are
Yeah.
stored at.
Yep.
I know you're not a part of the museum now, but if they wanted to tap into some of these interviews, how could they do it, or are they able to do it?
You can get into some of them. I don't know how many they have online anymore. I think it's called World War II, WW the number two dot
Yeah,
org, I think. or you could just Google National World War II Museum
National
of
War.
World
Yeah,
History. Yeah, and it'll come up. And there are several hundred that are on
yeah,
there. They're not all on there by any means. Hell, there's some on there that I know I did that aren't on there. Sweeney being one, he's not on there, which that I don't have any control over that. But regardless of this, um, there's several Pomeroy's on there, Pendleton's on
yeah.
there. I think Godone's on there, Quintana's on there, Goodrich I know's on there. A lot of the guys that we talked about today are in there. Richard Greer, he's in there. So I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, and it's not just Guadalcanal, obviously. There's all the war, but there's a lot of stuff in there. You'll hear my dulcet tones on quite a few of them.
Yeah, I've been in and listened to some there.
Yeah. But no, it's cool. It's a really fantastic resource, and like I said, it's one of the it's the most gratifying work I've ever done in my life was
I
collecting
bet.
those oral histories because, as you know, my wife has said, my team and I preserved the history of a generation to the best of our ability. Obviously, a lot of guys were gone for posterity, and it's not just an audio recording. It's like it's video. It's Frank
Mm.
Pomeroy sitting there telling you about escorting Japanese across the river to the Tenarue River to
Yeah,
go dig up dead bodies. It's there,
they're great. Yeah.
and it's incredibly invaluable to history. And I was very very proud to be a part of it.
No, you guys have done a great service, and especially, I guess, um, you being a historian, you know what value that's going to hold. Because once again, you look back. Imagine if you had the American Civil War
No, yeah,
like this. Imagine that.
yeah.
So you'll look someone 100 years from now look and go, "Geez, they'll hear you and see you too." And they're like, who's this guy?
Yeah,
Oh,
who's this
that's Seth.
clown?
That's the
Who's this
guy.
clown here?
Who's this clown? Yeah. You have a monument made to you, mate. You never know.
Nah. Maybe the only one that would do that would be my dog, but that's okay.
The big C.
Yeah.